Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. I attended the will reading simply to sever the rotting ties with my family. When my father pocketed $100 million while I received a one-way ticket to Hong Kong, the room believed I was erased. 3 days later, outside the airport, a stranger met my eyes and spoke 5 words. Your father took the bait. I realized then the money was not a reward. It was a trap. My name is Scarlett Ward. At 37 years old, I have spent the better part of my adult life putting out fires as the Director of Crisis Coordination at Northline Civic Supply. My daily existence is governed by managing disasters. Yet, nothing in my professional career prepared me for the suffocating stillness of the library in my family estate in Charleston. I returned not out of grief, but out of a grim obligation to witness the final closing of a ledger. We were here for the will reading of my grandmother, Evelyn Ward, the ruthless architect of the Ward Meridian Group, a private logistics empire. The air conditioning battled the heavy humid South Carolina afternoon, pressing against the windows. The room was packed with people who only gathered when there was blood in the water or money on the table. To every person here, I was the uncontrollable daughter. I was the one who walked away from the family business years ago because I could not stomach their moral compromises. They looked at me with a mixture of weariness and disdain. Directly across from me sat my father, Victor Ward. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his posture relaxed, his expression fixed in a serene mask of premature victory. Beside him sat his second wife, Celeste. She dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, ensuring everyone noticed her performance of grief. At the head of the heavy mahogany table sat Nolan Price, the longtime family attorney. He was visibly sweating under the weight of my grandmother's final commands. The rest of the room was padded with board members and relatives who had always been far more acquainted with the trust fund than with the matriarch. Nolan cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the dense legal jargon. The minor bequests took agonizingly long, a calculated build-up to the main event. And then it arrived, the distribution of the primary estate. Nolan looked down at the parchment, his voice gaining resonance. To her only son, Victor Ward, Evelyn bequeathed a staggering sum, $100 million in liquid cash, but the money was only the beginning. He was also granted sole lifetime use of the sprawling coastal mansion we were sitting in, along with the title to my grandmother's custom-muled yacht. A silent exhale rippled through the room. Celeste stopped dabbing her eyes and placed a manicured hand over my father's wrist. Victor did not gasp. He simply nodded slowly, his lips curling into a tight, self-satisfied smile. It was the look of a man who believed the universe had finally recognized his superiority in the eyes of everyone present. My father was the absolute winner. Then the heavy silence shifted. The invisible spotlight swung away from the victor and landed on me. Nolan shuffled the heavy cream-colored papers. He did not look me in the eye. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, painfully thin envelope. He slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped precisely in front of me. I stared at it. There was no bulky legal document inside. I picked it up. The paper was crisp. I broke the seal and tipped the contents out. A single piece of paper fluttered onto the wood. It was an airline ticket, a one-way ticket to Hong Kong. I looked inside the envelope again, expecting something else. A letter, an explanation, a final cruel jab, or a twisted message of affection. There was nothing, just the sturdily printed boarding pass and the cold vacuum of rejection. The silence held before the cruelty of the room broke surface. It started with a soft, poorly suppressed chuckle from a younger cousin. That sound acted as a permission slip. Soon, a low murmur of amusement rippled around the table. Celeste tilted her head, her face contorting into a mask of exaggerated saccharine pity. She looked at me as if I were a wounded bird, but it was my father who delivered the final blow. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was smooth, dripping with condescending satisfaction. It seems your grandmother finally figured out exactly what to do with you. Scarlett, he said, his voice carrying easily. She decided to send you right back where you belong, as far away from this family as humanly possible. The room waited for my reaction. They wanted the black sheep to scream, to validate their narrative of my instability. My chest tightened, a massive weight of humiliation and suppressed rage pressing against my lungs. But my career had trained me for this. You do not react to the noise. You look for the anomaly. I stood up slowly, keeping my face entirely blank. I picked up the boarding pass. I was about to walk out of that toxic house forever. But as my thumb brushed over the thick paper, my professional instinct flared. Something was wrong. I looked closer at the ticket. The booking date was not recent. It had been purchased exactly 7 months ago. This was premeditated. And then I saw it. Next to the printed seat assignment, there was a small hand-drawn circle. The ink was purple. It was the exact shade of the custom mixed deep violet ink Evelyn Ward had exclusively used in her private notebooks. This was not a cast-off. This was a calculated message. I kept my eyes on the ticket as I moved toward the double doors. Before I could reach the handle, my father's voice rang out again. Greed is a beast that is never full. Nolan, Victor said, his tone shifting to sharp business. The domestic holdings are clear, but Evelyn spent half her time in Asia over the last decade. Are there any undisclosed international assets? I stopped with my hand hovering over the door handle. I turned my head just enough to observe the lawyer. Nolan Price froze. He swallowed hard, a thin sheen of sweat suddenly materializing on his forehead. He aggressively shuffled his papers, refusing to meet my father's gaze. The international picture is highly complex, Victor Nolan stammered, his legal confidence evaporating. There are structures entirely separate from the domestic purview. We will discuss those matters strictly if they become legally relevant. The room just heard a lawyer being evasive about paperwork, but I recognized a man terrified of stepping on a landmine. Nolan was hiding something massive. I looked at the purple ink on my ticket. The $100 million was too easy. The yacht was too flashy. My grandmother despised flashy things. This whole reading was a performance, and my father was playing the fool. I walked out of the room without a single word. Late that night, I sat alone in my dim hotel room in downtown Charleston. The thick heat of the southern summer radiated through the glass. The thin envelope and the ticket lay on the desk. I could throw it away. I could fly back to my job, to my safe life of managing disasters and never look back. But as I stared at the deep, violet circle, I heard my grandmother's voice in my head. It was a memory from years ago, right before our relationship fractured completely. We had been sitting in her study. People reveal their true nature fastest when money is put on the table. Scarlett, she had said, never trust what they say before the check is written. Watch what they do after they think they have won. My father thought he had won. They all believed I was holding an insult. But Evelyn Ward never wasted money on simple insults. If she bought a ticket, she needed someone on that plane. I reached for my laptop. I typed in the confirmation code. I clicked confirm. I packed my bag. The humiliation I had swallowed had burned away, leaving only a cold, sharp clarity. I booked the flight. The humidity of Hong Kong hit me the moment the sliding glass doors of the arrivals terminal parted. It was a suffocating, dense heat, radically different from the southern bake I had left behind in South Carolina. The cacophony of the drop-off zone was overwhelming. Taxis honked relentlessly. Luggage wheels clattered against the cracked pavement, and a dozen languages blended into a frantic urban symphony. The air tasted of aviation fuel and impending rain, but my eyes were immediately drawn to a disruption in the chaos. Directly across from the curb, idling in a zone clearly marked for no parking, sat 3 identical black sedans. They were immaculate, aligned with military precision, their dark-tinted windows reflecting the harsh neon lights of the terminal. They did not belong in this frantic scramble. They were waiting. Before I could even adjust my grip on the strap of my travel bag, a figure detached himself from the shadow of the lead vehicle. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that seemed completely impervious to the sweltering heat. His posture was rigid, his expression an unreadable mask of professional discretion. He moved toward me with deliberate, unhurried steps, parting the sea of frantic travelers effortlessly. He stopped exactly 2 paces away. He did not ask for my name. Instead, he reached into his inner breast pocket and produced a thick, cream-colored card. He held it out to me with a steady hand. My breath hitched in my throat. Across the center, my name was written in the unmistakable deep violet ink my grandmother always used. The sweeping loops and sharp angles of her handwriting were a ghost materializing in the oppressive Asian night. I looked up from the card to the man's face. He met my gaze with chilling calm and spoke exactly 5 words. "Your father took the bait." A cold shock wave radiated outward from my chest, obliterating the exhaustion of the 14-hour flight. The man gestured toward the open rear door of the middle sedan. "My name is Adrian Lowe," he said, his voice smooth and faintly accented. "I was the senior legal counsel to Evelyn Ward in this region for over 2 decades. Please get in. We have a great deal of ground to cover and very little time to waste." I slid into the chilled leather interior of the car, my mind racing through a dozen different calculations. Adrian settled into the seat beside me as the convoy smoothly pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the chaotic traffic leaving the island. "You arrived on the 3rd day," Adrian stated, looking straight ahead at the sprawling illuminated skyline. "I was only authorized to wait at the terminal for a maximum of 7 days following the formal reading. Had you arrived on day 8, these cars would not be here. My explicit instructions were to permanently dissolve the holding structures and liquidate the assets to blind trusts if you failed to show. You are exactly on time." We drove in silence for nearly 45 minutes until we reached the central business district. The sheer scale of the skyscrapers towering over us felt like a physical weight. The sedans descended into the subterranean garage of a massive glass and steel monolith. We bypassed the main lobby entirely, taking a private security elevator that shot upward. My ears popped repeatedly as we ascended past dozens of floors. When the doors finally parted, I stepped into a sprawling high-altitude command center that defied every expectation I had of hidden offshore wealth. This was no Shari Shell Company office hiding illicit funds in manila folders. The floor was a hive of quiet, relentless, hyper-focused activity. Rows of analysts sat before glowing monitors tracking global shipping lanes, volatile commodity prices, and intricate supply chain logistics. The walls were lined with massive digital maps displaying real-time cargo movements across the Pacific Ocean. It was sterile, ruthlessly efficient, and vibrating with immense legitimate power. This was a machine operating at the absolute highest level of global commerce, and it was entirely invisible to the world my father inhabited. Adrian led me past the main bullpen and into a massive corner office overlooking the glittering expanse of the harbor. He walked behind a sprawling obsidian desk and unlocked a secure biometric drawer. He withdrew a sealed envelope, heavy and ancient-looking, and placed it precisely in the center of the dark glass surface. "She instructed me to hand this to you only if you walked through those doors of your own volition," he said quietly, taking a step back. "If you had ignored the ticket, this envelope would have been incinerated. It contains the key to her true legacy." I reached out, my fingers trembling just a fraction of an inch, and broke the heavy waxed seal. I unfolded the thick parchment. The letter was dated 2 years ago. I scanned the sharp violet handwriting, the ink cutting aggressively across the page. "My dearest Scarlett," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you still possess the strategic mind and the cold anger I always knew was inside you. You saw the charade in the library for what it was. By now, Victor has been handed exactly what he always demanded from me: cash, comfort, and the pathetic illusion of absolute supremacy. But you, my girl, are about to receive what he could never understand." I read the lines again, the gravity of her words anchoring me to the polished floor. "What he could never understand." I looked up at Adrian. He pressed a button on a small remote, and the smart glass wall behind him instantly transformed into a massive high-resolution digital display. A complex, sprawling ownership chart materialized in glowing blue lines. At the very top in bold, stark lettering was a name I had never encountered in any of the domestic family filings or board meetings: the Harbor Lantern Trust. Adrian approached the screen, tracing the descending lines of authority with a laser pointer. "This entity," he explained, his tone shifting into a sharp, uncompromising briefing, holds the controlling interest in a vast network of your grandmother's core assets throughout Asia and the western seaboard of the United States. It dictates the terms for the medical cold chain logistics, the disaster relief fleet, and the deep water port leases. None of this was ever fully consolidated into the domestic parent company. You know, it was deliberately and meticulously compartmentalized. It is the beating heart of the empire, generating the quiet, sustainable revenue that keeps the flashy domestic side afloat. I stared at the intricate web of corporate entities, holding companies and operational subsidiaries. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering designed to be entirely invisible from the outside, but absolutely dominant from the inside. And it was all routed through this single impenetrable trust. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow, realigning my entire understanding of the past decade. The one-way plane ticket had never been a final insult. It was not a dismissal to the other side of the world. It was an invitation, heavily disguised as a public humiliation. It was the very first test in a brutal gauntlet Evelyn had meticulously constructed before her body failed her. She needed to know if the fire in me had been entirely extinguished by years of corporate exile and relentless family alienation. She needed to see if I would accept the degradation of the domestic will reading, or if I would follow the faint, nearly invisible breadcrumbs she had left specifically for me. Adrian continued to outline the staggering scope of the trust. He detailed long-term leases on major shipping terminals, exclusive contracts with pharmaceutical giants for vaccine distribution, and a fleet of specialized cargo vessels that Victor did not even know existed. Everything my father thought he controlled back in the States was ultimately dependent on the logistical arteries managed by the people sitting in the room just outside this door. He owns the crown, Adrian said softly, reading the dawn of realization on my face. But the Harbor Lantern Trust owns the roads, the bridges, and the lifeblood of the kingdom. Without this network, the domestic company is just an empty shell waiting to collapse under its own weight. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city of Hong Kong stretched out beneath me, a glittering, restless beast of commerce and ambition. The dark waters of the harbor were dotted with the lights of massive container ships, moving slowly, silently, carrying the weight of the global economy on their steel backs. Some of those ships belonged to the network mapped out on the screen behind me. Some of those ships were now technically under my purview. The anger that had been simmering inside me since the will reading began to crystallize into something entirely different. It was no longer the messy, defensive rage of a misunderstood daughter trying to prove her worth to a room full of vultures. It was cold, structural, and violently focused. My grandmother had weaponized my alienation. She knew my father would take the cash and the flashy toys without ever bothering to look deeper into the foundation. She knew he possessed the greed of a scavenger, but entirely lacked the vision of an architect, and she knew I would notice the violet ink on a seemingly random boarding pass. She had spent years watching us, measuring our floors and our strengths from a distance, and she had built a trap so massive, so intricately designed, that my father had walked right into it with a triumphant smile on his face. The $100 million was just the cheese on the mouse trap. I turned away from the panoramic window and faced Adrian. The legal counsel stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for my command. He was not a man who served fools or pampered heirs. He had served a titan, and now he was waiting to see if the bloodline had managed to breed another one. I folded the letter fully, making sure the creases were perfectly aligned, and slid it back into the thick envelope. The girl who had been exiled from the family business was dead, buried under the weight of a meticulously planned inheritance. I looked at the sprawling chart of the Harbor Lantern Trust, tracing the glowing blue lines of absolute power with my eyes. The war had not ended in that suffocating library in Charleston. It had only just begun, and the battlefield was mine to control. Adrian typed a rapid sequence into the brushed steel console embedded in his desk. The sweeping corporate structure chart on the main glass wall dissolved, instantly replaced by a highly detailed, live topographical map of the Pacific Rim and the western seaboard of the United States. A new name materialized in stark white letters at the top of the display. Meridian Pacific. This Adrian announced, his voice slicing through the quiet hum of the climate control is the real engine behind the shell. I stepped closer to the glowing display, my eyes tracking hundreds of pulsing green and amber nodes scattered across ocean accounts, shell companies, and tax evasion. But what I was looking at was a massive living organism of global commerce. Adrian began to pull up the operational manifests, projecting them next to the map. I read the readouts and felt a profound sense of awe replace my initial shock. I saw dedicated maritime fleets specifically engineered for medical cold chain logistics. These were not standard cargo ships. They were floating state-of-the-art cryogenic storage facilities proudly transporting life biologics and emergency blood plasma across the Pacific. I saw massive fortified seaport warehousing complexes situated strategically in high-risk seismic and typhoon zones. I saw active ironclad multi-dead government contracts for trans-Pacific emergency disaster relief and rapid response supply lines. This was not a graveyard for hidden wealth. It was the most sustainable, deeply entrenched segment of the empire Evelyn had built. It generated staggering tangible profit. The margins were not padded by creative accounting tricks. They were secured by absolute monopolies on critical global crisis infrastructure. But the true magnitude of what my grandmother had done only became clear when Adrian brought up the governance bylaws. He highlighted a specific clause buried deep within a master operating agreement between Meridian Pacific and the domestic parent company back in America. I read the dense legal text 3 times to ensure my mind was not playing tricks on me in the late hour. The clause was an absolute kill switch. It granted this exact Asian subsidiary controlled entirely by the harbor Lanton Trust unilateral veto power over any domestic sell-off, any hostile merger, and any dissolution of strategic physical assets belonging to the parent group. My father thought he was the undisputed king of the boardroom back in South Carolina. He strutted around the estate, believing his word was final. He had absolutely no idea that the real scepter, the ultimate authority to dismantle or preserve the company, was sitting in a secure server rack in a Hong Kong skyscraper. Without the explicit authorized signature of the harbor Lanton Trust beneficiary, Victor could not legally liquidate a single major warehouse or sell a single shipping route. He was a king locked inside a castle, completely unaware that someone else held the deed to the land underneath it. Adrian turned away from the screen and walked over to a heavy floor safe. He retrieved the thick leather-bound ledger and handed it to me. It was Evelyn's personal strategic diary. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling. I opened it and turned the thick cream-colored pages. Her assessments of the business were brilliant, but her assessments of her own bloodline were clinical and utterly devastating. Victor is a creature of the surface, she had written in her sharp, uncompromising violet script. He is hopelessly hypnotized by fast liquidity and the illusion of immediate power. He would eagerly sell the future of this company just to hear the applause of the board today. He understands the daily price of our stock, but he is completely blind to the actual physical value of our infrastructure. I turned the page, and my breath caught in my throat. I saw my own name underlined twice. Scarlett is the only one who ever fought me on the balance sheet. The entry read, "She is the only one who explicitly refused to cut the disaster relief supply routes simply because they were not optimized for maximum quarterly profit. She understands a fundamental truth that escapes her father. True power comes from what you hold when the world falls apart, not what you sell when the market is up." Reading those words violently yanked me back 8 years into the past. The memory tasted like copper and old bitter regret. I had been sitting in a sterile, freezing boardroom in Charleston, surrounded by my father, Celeste, and a pack of sycophantic financial advisors. They had presented a ruthless, clinically detached restructuring plan. It demanded the immediate closure and liquidation of 4 major supply warehouses located dead center in the Gulf Coast hurricane corridor. They argued the year-round maintenance costs were an unacceptable drag on our annual yield. I had stood up, slammed my hands flat on the mahogany table, and flatly refused to sign off on the closures. I looked my father in the eye and told him those warehouses were the only things keeping entire coastal communities alive during Category 5 storms. I told him we were a logistics company, not a hedge fund, and we had an obligation to the regions we serviced. My father had laughed. He called me naive, a bleeding heart who let emotion cloud her judgment, and stated I had no business running a $1 billion firm. The entire family labeled me a traitor to the bottom line. I packed my office that same afternoon, walked out the glass doors, and never went back for 8 years. I thought Evelyn had silently agreed with them. Now, staring at her private ledger, I realized my defiance was exactly what had earned me the keys to the real kingdom. I closed the heavy ledger and looked up at Adrian. My father walked away from that reading with $100 million in liquid cash. I said, heaping my voice dead, "That is a massive amount of capital to fight a war with. Adrian, it buys a lot of lawyers and a lot of influence." Adrian allowed a razor-thin, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. It was the first time I had seen the stoic man show any genuine amusement. "That $100 million is nothing more than a highly publicized severance package," he corrected softly, his tone laced with a quiet, lethal satisfaction. "It was deliberately and surgically separated from the core operating capital of the group. It carries absolutely zero controlling shares. It grants no board seats. It provides no voting rights regarding the overarching empire. It is pure dumb cash." He walked back over to the console and brought up a new document, a heavily redacted legal covenant filled with dense, impenetrable clauses. If Victor simply takes the money, buys a few more oceanfront properties, and remains quietly in his coastal mansion, he will die a very wealthy, blissfully oblivious man. Adrian explained. But Evelyn knew her son better than anyone. She knew his ego would never allow him to accept that there was a hidden room he was not allowed to enter. Adrian pointed to a specific paragraph glowing on the screen. "If he attempts to hunt down the rest of the estate, if he makes a single aggressive legal move to pierce the veil of the Harbor Lantern Trust, he automatically triggers a series of defensive legal tripwires Evelyn designed herself. By formally challenging the international structure, he places his own inheritance in catastrophic legal jeopardy. The clauses are completely automated. The moment he files a motion for discovery against these assets, the trap snaps shut." The silence in the sprawling office grew incredibly heavy, thick with the staggering implication of what Adrian had just revealed. My pulse hammered a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. I thought back to the will reading. I remembered my father leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with insatiable greed, asking Nolan Price about undisclosed international assets. He could not just take his massive victory and walk away. He had to have it all. The 5 words Adrian had spoken to me outside the sweltering airport were not a dramatic metaphor. They were a literal status update. Victor was already pushing himself toward the tripwire. This was not going to be a messy, emotional family feud fought with screaming matches in mahogany libraries and tearful accusations in the press. This was a meticulously engineered corporate slaughter, and my role in this impending war was not to aggressively attack him. My role was far colder and required far more discipline. I simply had to stand back, hold the door wide open, and let my father believe he was about to win one final glorious victory right before the floor completely collapsed beneath his feet. I looked back out at the dark harbor, the massive cargo ships moving like silent leviathans through the water, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. For the next 72 hours, the opulent corner office transformed into a relentless war room. The adrenaline that had carried me across the Pacific Ocean morphed into a cold, sustained focus. I sat flanked by Adrian and a woman introduced to me as Naomi Pike. Naomi served as the head of global compliance for the trust. She was a forensic accountant whose quiet, unassuming demeanor masked a terrifying and surgical intellect. Together, we initiated a ruthless dissection of the parent company's operational history. We were not looking at the future projections. We were excavating the buried past. We pulled archived server data, cross-referenced decades of vendor contracts, and painstakingly mapped out the complex ownership models of every third-party contractor the domestic side had utilized over the last 10 years. It took Naomi less than 48 hours to find the rot hidden beneath the polished surface. She projected a series of procurement logs onto the glass wall. At first glance, they appear to be standard, unremarkable agreements with independent logistics suppliers based in the American Midwest. But Naomi layered the bank routing data directly over the corporate registries. The seemingly independent suppliers were nested within a labyrinth of holding companies. At the absolute bottom of that maze, hidden behind layers of corporate obscurity and offshore proxies, sat two very familiar beneficiaries, my father and Nolan Price. They had been steadily, quietly bleeding the domestic company for years. They routinely approved highly inflated invoices for phantom consulting, routing the excess capital straight into their own private accounts. It was an elegant, insidious form of corporate parasitism. The immediate instinct of an angry daughter would be to leak this damning data to the financial press or hand it directly to the federal authorities. I felt the familiar burr of betrayal flare in my chest, a desperate, childish urge to confront him and tear down his flawless public reputation. But my career in crisis coordination kicked in, suffocating that emotional impulse before it could take root. I stared hard at the data. It was highly suspicious, perhaps even fatal in a protracted civil suit, but it was historical. A clever defense attorney could easily drag the litigation out for years, claiming administrative errors or blaming subordinate executives who had conveniently resigned. To execute a flawless decapitation, I did not just need evidence of past sins. I needed my father to actively, willingly commit a fatal error in the present tense. I needed him to dig his own grave while the whole world was watching. I turned to Adrian and outlined my strategy. We were going to feed him a heavily sanitized, carefully redacted summary of the international holdings. I instructed Naomi to compile a dossier that revealed just enough of the Asian infrastructure to prove its immense profitability, but completely obscured the defensive legal mechanisms Evelyn had installed. We would send this document back to the United States. It would act as a blazing beacon, illuminating the massive unclaimed treasure chest just outside his current reach. My father was a man who physically could not tolerate the idea of leaving money on the table. Once he saw the staggering numbers, his ego would entirely override his caution. He would view the $100 million he had just inherited not as a final victory, but as an insulting fraction of what he was truly owed. As Naomi prepared the document, she paused and unlocked a highly secure partition on her tablet. "There is one more element you must be aware of," she said softly. "Before her health completely failed, your grandmother recorded a final sworn legal testimony on video. It is a direct address to the board of directors and the primary beneficiaries." I asked why Adrian had not shown it to me immediately upon my arrival. Naomi explained the ironclad stipulations attached to the digital file. The video was heavily encrypted and subject to strict legal release conditions. It could only be unsealed and broadcast in the event of a formal documented dispute regarding the ultimate control of the trust. If no one challenged the current arrangement, the video would remain permanently locked. It was Evelyn's ultimate weapon, but it required an active enemy to trigger it. While Naomi finalized the redactions on the financial dossier, I began to sift through a separate physical archive she had retrieved from deep storage. These were Evelyn's personal correspondences, the physical artifacts of her final years. I opened a heavy leather-bound folder and found myself staring at a stack of thick envelopes. My name was written across each one in that familiar sweeping violet ink. I checked the dates stamped on the corners. They spanned the entire 7 years since my exile from the family. I carefully opened the first one. It was a formal invitation to join her in Tokyo to evaluate a new shipping route. The second was a detailed analysis of a failed corporate merger, asking for my specific perspective on the crisis management fallout. The third, dated merely months before her passing, was a quiet, desperate plea to bridge the suffocating silence between us. My hands began to shake as I realized the catastrophic magnitude of what I was holding. None of these letters had ever reached my apartment in Chicago. None of these messages had ever breached my inbox. I looked at the routing slips attached to the physical copies. They had all been intercepted and signed for by the Central Domestic Mail Room, an office directly under the absolute control of my father's executive assistant. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. The war had just mutated into something entirely different. This was no longer just a battle over corporate control or a fight against financial greed. Someone in that house, acting under my father's direct orders, had systematically and maliciously severed the only remaining bridge between me and the only person in my family who had ever truly seen my worth. They had stolen my grandmother from me years before she actually died, ensuring she believed I had callously ignored her final attempts at reconciliation. The cold, strategic detachment I had been maintaining cracked, replaced by a dark, absolute resolve. I did not want to just defeat Victor Ward in a boardroom. I wanted to completely dismantle the false narrative he had built his entire life upon. I instructed Adrian to send the redacted financial summary directly to Nolan Price's private secure server. Attached to that document, I included a single brief message directed exclusively to my father. It contained no threats, no accusations, and no emotional appeals. It was forged from pure steel. "If you wish to understand the full scope of the legacy you have been denied," I wrote, "you will cease sending lawyers and you will present yourself in Hong Kong through the surveillance network Adrian maintained within the domestic communication channels." We received a detailed report of the exact moment the message was delivered to the estate in Charleston. So I had expected my father to erupt in a violent rage at the sheer audacity of my demand. I expected him to immediately draft a dozen cease and desist orders or freeze my domestic accounts. But the report noted something far more chilling. Upon reading the financial summary and my ultimatum, my father did not shout. He dismissed his staff, poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, and smiled. When Adrian relayed that detail to me, a profound, eerie calm washed over the war room. That smile was the ultimate confirmation that the psychological warfare had worked perfectly. My father was completely blind to the trap. He smiled because he thought I had finally broken under the pressure. He believed I had discovered the hidden assets, but lacked the authority or the intelligence to control them, and was now desperately calling him across the world to negotiate a surrender. He was already planning how to strip the trust bare and toss me aside with a pitiful settlement. Only a man absolutely certain he is walking toward a glorious, unopposed victory can smile with such genuine warmth while stepping directly onto a landmine. I looked at the stack of stolen letters on the desk, the violet ink glowing under the harsh office lights. He was coming, and I was ready to let him bring about his own downfall. My father stepped into the executive suite, looking exactly like a man arriving to claim a misplaced piece of luggage. He wore a perfectly tailored light gray suit that somehow remained completely untouched by the punishing Asian humidity outside. He was flanked by Celeste, who offered a tight, glossy smile that barely reached her cold eyes, and Nolan Price, who nervously clutched a thick leather briefcase as if it were a life preserver. Victor walked straight past the sweeping panoramic views of the Victoria Harbor and took the seat at the head of the conference table. He did this entirely uninvited, projecting an aura of absolute ownership. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and looked at me with an expression of practiced paternal concern. He did not ask how my flight was. He did not ask how I was holding up after the funeral. He started his assault by offering protection. He smoothly suggested that the international legal landscape was far too treacherous for someone with my specific background in civic supply management. He painted Adrian and the entire Hong Kong corporate team as predatory operators, a group of shadowy lawyers ready to take advantage of an inexperienced, grieving heir. His voice dropped an octave, adopting a tone of gentle, condescending persuasion. He proposed a clean break. He offered me a highly generous 8-figure buyout right then and there. He spun it as a chance for me to take a massive sum of money and live comfortably, far away from the crushing, complicated pressure of global corporate governance. He wanted me to believe he was doing me a massive favor by removing the burden of my grandmother's secret empire from my shoulders. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the stack of stolen letters in his face to prove his deceit. I simply let him finish his prepared speech. When the room fell silent, I stood up and invited him to physically inspect the very thing he was so desperately trying to buy from me. Over the next 48 hours, I dragged Victor, Celeste, and a heavily sweating Nolan Price through the grueling, deafening reality of Meridian Pacific. We did not sit in air-conditioned boardrooms sipping premium water. I took them directly to the massive cold chain logistics hubs located near the industrial container ports. We walked through towering aisles of climate-controlled warehouses, holding millions of doses of emergency medical supplies. We stood on the concrete docks of the disaster relief staging grounds, where heavy cargo ships were actively being loaded for typhoon zones across the Pacific Rim. I forced my father to physically walk the floor of the empire Evelyn had built in the shadows. He had to smell a harsh diesel fuel, hear the deafening roar of the massive refrigeration units, and see the sheer, staggering scale of the physical operation. What irritated Victor most was not the oppressive heat or the industrial noise. It was the absolute reverence the senior operational managers held for Evelyn Ward, and more dangerously for his fragile ego. It was how quickly they extended that exact same respect to me. They did not treat me like a road daughter temporarily playing executive dress-up. When I asked incisive questions about supply chain bottlenecks, emergency route optimization, and geopolitical risks, they answered me directly, recognizing the legitimate successor. Victor trailed behind our groups, his forced paternal smile growing increasingly brittle with each passing hour. I watched him closely from across a busy loading dock, applying a quiet internal analysis to his behavior. In my line of work, I had spent years studying the anatomy of corporate collapse. It was a rigorous framework of business failure analysis, a method to understand exactly why massive, seemingly invincible entities suddenly crumbled. The root cause was almost always identical. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership, specifically when executives prioritize short-term liquidity over sustainable vital infrastructure. My father was a walking, breathing embodiment of that fatal flaw. He possessed absolutely no intellectual curiosity about the complex life systems operating right in front of him. He looked at a fleet of cryogenic medical transports and only saw depreciating physical assets and unacceptable maintenance overhead costs. The thin facade of family reconciliation finally shattered on the third evening. We sat in a private, heavily guarded dining room high above the city skyline. The table was laden with an extravagant multi-course meal that Victor had loudly insisted on paying for, a remarkably petty display of financial dominance. The conversation had been painfully strained, filled with Celeste making vapid, empty observations about the city lights. Finally, Victor pushed his porcelain plate away and leaned heavily across the table. The warm, protective father routine was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a corporate liquidator. He looked directly into my eyes and asked the single question that had been burning a hole in his mind since the moment he stepped off his private jet. What is the precise valuation of this entire network if we dismantle it and sell it off in separate individual pieces? He did not care about the ironclad medical distribution contracts. He did not care about the relief routes keeping coastal cities alive. He only wanted to know the scrap value of the empire. In that exact moment, watching the naked greed illuminate his face, I knew any lingering sliver of moral authority he thought he held had evaporated completely. He had profoundly lost the ethical war before the legal battle had even commenced. I kept my face perfectly still. I politely excused myself from the table under the pretense of taking an urgent phone call from the coordination center. I stepped out of the dining room and walked down the quiet carpeted corridor where Adrian was waiting silently in the shadows. The lawyer did not speak a single word. He simply reached into his jacket and handed me a secure encrypted tablet. On the glowing screen was a highly confidential legal filing that our surveillance team had intercepted just an hour ago. While my father was smiling at me over an expensive dinner, asking casual questions about valuations and asset liquidation, his legal team back in the United States had filed a remarkably aggressive injunction in a federal court. He was officially requesting a complete immediate freeze on all voting rights and asset transfers associated with the Harbor Lantern Trust. He was attempting to legally paralyze the entire Asian operation before he even understood the catastrophic legal minefield he was walking blindly into. He was moving to seize absolute control through the courts while pretending to negotiate a peaceful buyout to my face. I read the injunction twice to ensure I understood the sheer audacity of his betrayal. I handed the tablet back to Adrian. The old version of me, the angry, reactive girl who had stormed out of the Charleston boardroom 8 years ago, would have marched straight back into that dining room and screamed. I would have flipped the table, shattered the crystal glasses, and cursed him for his relentless, pathological deceit. I would have given him exactly what he wanted, a hysterical daughter proving she was entirely unfit to lead. But that girl was dead. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold reality of the situation anchor my racing heart. I smoothed the front of my dress and walked calmly back into the private room. Victor was swirling the expensive amber liquid in his glass, looking exceptionally pleased with himself. He believed he had successfully cornered me. I pulled out my chair and sat down opposite him. I folded my hands neatly on the heavy linen tablecloth. The silence stretched between us, growing heavy and dangerous. He expected me to finally crack under the pressure, to shout accusations, or to quietly reach for a pen to sign his insulting buyout papers. Instead, I let my gaze lock entirely onto his. I did not blink. I stripped every ounce of emotion, anger, and daughterly expectation from my voice. I spoke with a flat, undeniable certainty that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10. "Dad," I said softly, the single word hanging in the chilled air between us, "if this were only money, you would already have it." The morning following that suffocating dinner, the atmosphere inside the Executive Command Center was stripped of its usual quiet efficiency. It felt electric, heavy with the distinct pressure of an incoming storm. Adrian stood completely still before the massive glass wall, an encrypted tablet clutched tightly in his hand. He did not offer a formal greeting when I walked through the double doors. He simply swiped his finger across the screen, casting a dozen different news articles onto the primary digital display. The financial blogs, corporate news syndicates, and industry journals had exploded overnight. The public narrative had been perfectly constructed, incredibly polished, and entirely fabricated. The headlines blared with sensationalized corporate gossip. I read the words projected on the glass and felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I was no longer an anonymous executive. The articles painted me as the arranged, bitter, and highly unstable heir to the Ward family. According to the press, I was furious about being left out of the primary domestic inheritance and was now launching a desperate, scorched earth campaign to hunt down hidden offshore cash. The strategy was brutally effective. Celeste had clearly been working the phones. She was quoted anonymously across multiple publications as a deeply concerned family confidant. Through carefully calculated leaks, she fed the press a steady stream of toxic half-truths. She described my history of sudden departures, my supposed inability to handle high-stakes pressure, and my notorious hot temper. She crafted a story of a damaged woman lashing out at her family. In stark contrast, Victor was framed as the stoic, responsible patriarch. The article suggested he was being forced into a massive international legal battle solely to protect the vital legacy of the company from the erratic emotional outbursts of his own child. He was positioned as the noble guardian. I was positioned as the existential threat. Before I could even process the sheer volume of the smear campaign, the second, far more devastating blow landed. My private cell phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed the name of the chief executive officer of Northline Civic Supply, my boss back in the United States. I took the call in a soundproof side office. His voice was apologetic, but possessed the rigid firmness of a man protecting his own bottom line. He informed me that several of Northline's major supply partners, entities deeply and quietly tied to the Ward Meridian Group, had abruptly threatened to pull their contracts. They cited severe concerns about image conflicts and corporate stability. They explicitly demanded my removal from the crisis coordination role while my messy public family feud played out in the international press. My boss formally requested that I take an immediate indefinite leave of absence. That phone call hit me far harder than any courtroom injunction or leaked article ever could. It stole the breath right out of my lungs. For almost a decade, I had bled for Northline. I had built a sterling reputation based on absolute competence, flawless reliability, and unbreakable emotional control under catastrophic pressure. Now, Victor was reaching across the ocean to burn down the one sanctuary I had built entirely with my own hands. He had correctly identified my deepest vulnerability. He knew I had spent my entire adult life fighting to be seen as a legitimate, highly capable professional. He wanted to strip me of that hard-earned identity and brutally reduce me back to the rebellious, uncontrollable daughter who had stormed out of a boardroom 8 years ago. I walked back into the main war room, my hands shaking slightly. Adrian was pacing, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an aggressive tactical energy. He strongly advised launching an immediate public relations counterattack. He wanted to leak the damning procurement logs Naomi had discovered. He wanted to expose the financial rot my father had hidden in the domestic branches and drag Victor down into the mud with me. But my background was in managing disasters, not amplifying them. I knew from years of corporate crisis intervention that playing defense in a media war only validates the initial attack. Answering mud with mud just leaves everyone dirty, and the public always sides with the established patriarch over the angry prodigal child. I needed a move so cleanly devastating, so unassailable, that it would instantly shatter their fabricated narrative. I looked at Adrian and Naomi, pushing the exhaustion and the stinging betrayal out of my mind. I instructed Adrian to draft an immediate, legally binding public declaration and release it to every major financial outlet across the globe. I was formally requesting a comprehensive independent, forensic audit of all international and domestic assets tied to Ward Meridian Group. I demanded that the auditors specifically scrutinize every single entity operating under the Harbor Lantern Trust, including the very assets I was poised to inherit. I wanted every ledger opened, every contract reviewed, and every hidden transaction brought into the blinding light. Adrian stopped pacing. He stared at me, genuinely shocked by the sheer scale of the order. He warned me that initiating an audit of that immense magnitude would temporarily freeze our own operations and open our entire Asian playbook to intense hostile scrutiny. I told him that was exactly the point. A greedy, unstable heir trying to steal hidden money does not voluntarily invite federal-level forensic auditors into her own house. A thief relies on darkness. Only someone with absolute integrity and nothing to hide demands the lights be turned on. We issued the press release less than 2 hours later, beating the closure of the Asian financial markets. The effect was practically instantaneous. The senior executives, fleet managers, and regional directors within Meridian Pacific, who had been nervously watching the media smear campaign unfold, immediately recognized the strategic brilliance of the move. Transparency cemented my authority in a way that no defensive press conference ever could. By offering up my own potential inheritance for microscopic examination, I proved my loyalty lay with the survival of the logistics network, not my own bank account. Victor lost his absolute control over the public narrative in a single afternoon. Our intelligence gathering indicated he was furiously throwing a tirade in his luxury hotel suite. He had assumed I would panic, fight back emotionally, and prove his point. Instead, I had calmly locked the doors and called the police on both of us. Yet, despite losing the public relations momentum, Victor remained dangerously confident. He operated on the belief that he possessed far more endurance than I did. He was convinced that if he just maintained the grueling legal pressure and continued to ruin my professional reputation back home, the sheer exhaustion of the fight would eventually force me to surrender. Late that evening, long after the analysts had gone home and the towering office was plunged into quiet shadow, Naomi Pike walked softly into my suite. She did not bring another financial report or a media summary. She carried an aged, heavily sealed manila envelope. She placed it carefully on the desk in front of me. Inside were certified legal copies of 3 specific letters my grandmother had written to me over the past several years. The same letters we knew had been intercepted, but this envelope contained something far more lethal than emotional validation. Naomi had utilized her compliance access to pull the official corporate courier logs from the domestic headquarters. Pinned to the back of each letter was a formal receipt of delivery, permanently time-stamped and legally binding. The signature accepting the private mail did not belong to a random mailroom clerk or a low-level assistant. The ink on the receipt belonged unmistakably to Nolan Price, signing explicitly on behalf of the executive office of Victor Ward. It was the definitive actionable proof that the isolation I had suffered was not a family misunderstanding. It was a documented, sanctioned corporate conspiracy orchestrated by my own father. I traced the signature with my finger, feeling the final remnants of my familial hesitation burn away into white-hot ash. The siege was over. It was time to go on the offensive. The silence in my suite felt suffocating as I stared at the 3 certified copies of the letters Naomi had left on my desk. For years, I had built a fortress around my heart, believing my grandmother had completely washed her hands of me. I carefully broke the seal on the oldest envelope. The parchment was thick, the violet ink still vibrant. As I read the first few lines, a profound agonizing numbness spread through my chest. Evelyn was not writing to reprimand me. She was writing to offer me a position. She had formally requested that I returned to the company as a senior strategic advisor, citing my unparalleled understanding of crisis infrastructure. I opened the second letter, dated 2 years later. The tone was no longer strictly professional. It was laced with a quiet, dignified sorrow. She asked why I had ignored her previous overtures. She wrote about her failing health and her desperate need for someone in the family who valued the physical foundation of the business over the daily stock ticker. The third letter, written just months before her death, was a final raw plea for reconciliation. I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of the deception wash over me. Every single Thanksgiving dinner, every brief family gathering where my father had pulled me aside to sadly inform me that Evelyn was too disappointed to speak with me. It had all been a meticulously choreographed lie. He had not just stolen my inheritance. He had stolen my family. He had deliberately starved a relationship to death to ensure I remained isolated and powerless. The numbness gave way to a white-hot, paralyzing rage. It was a physical sensation burning the back of my throat. I was so consumed by the revelation that I barely registered the sound of the suite door opening. Naomi Pike walked in carrying a heavy encrypted hard drive. She saw the letters spread out on my desk and the murderous clarity in my eyes. She did not offer pity. She simply plugged the drive into the secure terminal on the glass table. She explained that while I was processing the physical mail, she had finished decrypting Evelyn's most highly secured digital vault. It contained unedited operational diaries and covert internal audio recordings from the executive boardrooms in Charleston. Naomi triggered a playback file from 4 years ago. The crisp digitized audio filled the room. I heard my grandmother's voice, sharp and unyielding, clashing violently with the smooth, condescending tone of my father. They were arguing over the Meridian Pacific portfolio. Victor was aggressively lobbying to liquidate the entire Asian medical logistics network. He argued that the profit margins were too slow, the overhead too heavy. He wanted to drain the capital from those life-saving supply lines and pump it directly into a highly speculative, incredibly flashy luxury real estate development on the Florida coast. He wanted to trade refrigerated vaccine ships for penthouses. Evelyn brutally shut him down, calling his vision hollow in his greed and existential threat to the legacy. That the audio file was merely the prelude to the true devastation. Naomi brought up a series of archived internal emails and redacted compliance reports dating back exactly 8 years. This was the exact timeline of my supposedly catastrophic career failure. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. When I was 29 years old, a massive supply chain collapse in the Gulf Coast had nearly crippled the domestic firm. I was the regional director at the time. The internal investigation had concluded that I had naively authorized unvetted cut-rate transport contractors who abandoned our cargo during a Category 5 hurricane. The shame of that failure had forced my resignation. Now, staring at the unredacted truth, the final pieces of my past snapped violently into place. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had never authorized those subpar contractors. Victor had secretly bypassed my authority, forging my digital signature on a series of shadow approvals to secure kickbacks from those very same unreliable trucking firms. When the hurricane hit and the supply lines failed catastrophically, he had simply altered the server logs, shifting the entirety of the blame onto his rebellious daughter. He had used my professional honor as a human shield to cover his own illicit financial schemes. He had assassinated my character to save his own skin. I was breathing heavily, the air feeling thin and inadequate. The trauma of the past decade had not been a tragic result of my own incompetence or my family's fundamental misunderstanding of my nature. It had been a systemic intentional execution of my identity. Adrian entered the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He looked at the glowing monitors, absorbing the gravity of the revelations. He stepped forward and placed a single sheet of paper over the keyboard, forcing me to look up. It was a highly specific, heavily highlighted extract from the Master Charter of the Harbor Lantern Trust. "There is a mechanism buried in the final quartil of the will," Adrian said, his voice dropping to a growly whisper. "It is a punitive clause of absolute severity. If your father files a formal legal claim to seize the trust and during that process he submits a fraudulent declaration or intentionally conceals a material conflict of interest, an automatic trigger is pulled." Adrian paused, letting the silence emphasize his next words. "The $100 million in liquid cash he received at the domestic reading is entirely contingent on his good faith conduct regarding the broader estate. If he breaches that faith through perjury or fraud in his pursuit of the Asian assets, the entirety of that $100 million is immediately and irrevocably forfeited. It does not go to you. It is instantly transferred into a perpetual sustainability fund dedicated to the pensions and welfare of the warehouse workers and sailors." I stared at the legal text. Evelyn had not just built a defensive wall. She had built a guillotine. She knew Victor would never be satisfied with the cash. She knew he would lie, cheat, and fabricate evidence to claim the rest. And she had rigged the system so that the very act of reaching for more would vaporize the fortune he already held in his hands. It was the ultimate poetic retribution. It was a blade perfectly designed for the right person to wield. Adrian asked if we should present this clause to Victor's legal team immediately. A simple warning would undoubtedly force him to drop the injunction and retreat to South Carolina with his remaining wealth. I looked back at the intercepted letters. I looked at the forged signatures that had cost me 8 years of my career and my grandmother's final years of life. A warning would save him. A warning would be an act of mercy. I folded the extract and handed it back to Adrian. "We say absolutely nothing," I commanded, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "We do not warn him. We do not threaten him. We let him build his case. We let him sign his fraudulent affidavit. He has spent his entire life treating people like disposable assets. Now he is going to walk into that boardroom convinced he has orchestrated the perfect takeover, and he is going to sign his own financial death warrant. I am not going to defeat my father out of spite. I am going to let his own boundless greed destroy him." The expanded board meeting convened at 9:00 in the morning, linking the Hong Kong executive suite with the primary boardroom in South Carolina via a heavily encrypted video wall. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that today was designed to be an execution. I sat perfectly still, flanked by Adrian and Naomi, watching my father orchestrate his grand theater. Victor did not simply rely on his own lawyers. He had brought in mercenaries. He introduced an incredibly slick, highly aggressive external valuation expert and a former senior auditor who had conveniently spent the last 5 years working for a rival logistics conglomerate. They took the floor with rehearsed clinical precision. For 2 grueling hours, they projected fabricated risk models and aggressively skewed financial projections across the screens. The former auditor systematically tore into the architecture of the Harbor Lantern Trust, officially testifying that the entire entity displayed severe hallmarks of a biased, utterly non-transparent corporate structure deliberately designed to defraud the domestic parent company. They used phrases like fiduciary negligence, malicious asset shielding, and rogue offshore management. I watched the faces of the domestic board members projected on the massive digital wall. These were the men and women who had known me since I was a teenager, the same people who had happily watched me get exiled 8 years ago. I saw their expressions shifting from neutral observation to active concern. The members who were securely inside my father's pocket began nodding along a heavy encrypted hard drive. Even a few of the neutral directors, individuals I had hoped would see through the charade, looked deeply unsettled by the auditor's aggressive testimony. For the very first time since I had stepped off the plane in Asia, a sharp, icy spike of genuine fear pierced my chest. The possibility of total failure was no longer just a psychological threat used in a negotiation. It was a tangible, rapidly approaching reality. Victor was systematically dismantling my credibility in front of the entire global leadership, turning the very infrastructure I was trying to protect into a weapon against me. Sensing the absolute shift in the room's momentum, Victor expertly paused the presentation. He adjusted his silk tie, projecting the image of a benevolent, weary patriarch who simply wanted to end a tragic family dispute. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes locking onto mine across the Pacific Ocean. He offered a compromise. It was a masterclass in public humiliation, thinly disguised as mercy. He proposed that I immediately and irrevocably surrender all voting rights and executive control associated with the trust. In exchange, he offered to purchase a sprawling but historic townhouse in Boston for me, entirely paid off. He threw in a substantial multi-million-dollar severance package to ensure my permanent silence. And as a final insulting cherry on top of the surrender document, he offered me the entirely fabricated, toothless title of Honorary Director of Philanthropic Supply. It was an offer designed to loudly broadcast to the board that I was merely a petulant child throwing a tantrum, one who could be easily bought off with a shiny new toy and a meaningless badge. I felt Adrian tense beside me, ready to launch a furious legal objection. I reached out under the heavy mahogany table and grabbed his wrist, squeezing hard to keep him silent. I needed Victor to believe his brutal siege had worked. I lowered my gaze, staring at the polished wood. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch, perfectly mimicking the body language of a completely broken woman. I looked back up, ensuring my voice sounded hollow and entirely defeated. I told the board that the sheer volume of the allegations was overwhelming. I formally requested a recess of 24 hours to consult with my counsel and seriously consider the terms of the settlement. A terrifyingly warm, triumphant smile spread across my father's face. He graciously granted the recess. He genuinely believed that his relentless media smear campaign, combined with the crushing legal pressure of the fabricated audit, had finally snapped my spine. He thought the war was over. At 2:00 the following morning, the Hong Kong Command Center was completely dark, except for the harsh glowing light of Naomi's primary workstation. She had not slept. She had been aggressively hunting through the shadow ledgers, tracing the exact trajectory of the cash inheritance Victor had received at the initial reading. She called me over to the terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard to unlock a highly classified banking portal. "Look at the collateral holding accounts," she whispered, her voice vibrating with suppressed adrenaline. He could not just take the win. He could not just walk away rich. I leaned over her shoulder, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted banking data she had managed to intercept through the compliance network. Victor had not deposited his inheritance into a conservative trust or used it to purchase luxury real estate as he usually did. Instead, he had taken exactly $75 million of that cash and locked it into a high-yield escrow account at an aggressive investment bank. He was actively using the bulk of his liquid inheritance as direct collateral to secure a massive, highly leveraged corporate loan. The destination of that loan was glaringly obvious. He was quietly preparing a hostile maneuver to sweep up all the remaining floating shares of Ward Meridian back in the United States. He wanted to dilute the voting power of the neutral board members and establish an absolute dictatorial grip over the domestic parent company. I stared at the glowing numbers, feeling a profound, terrifying awe at the sheer brilliance of my grandmother's foresight. This was the exact fatal misstep she had been waiting for from beyond the grave. Evelyn knew that if you handed Victor a fortune, he would never just sit on it to enjoy a comfortable life. He would inevitably weaponize it to feed his insatiable hunger for absolute dominance. By pledging the inheritance to finance a hostile corporate takeover, he had directly violated the core defensive covenant of the will. He had transformed the severance package into an instrument of war. The trap had not just been set. My father had eagerly stepped inside and locked the door behind himself. I turned away from the monitors, my exhaustion instantly replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I looked at Adrian and Naomi. The time for passive defense and psychological games was completely over. We spent the next 4 hours synchronizing a three-pronged execution protocol for the morning session. First, Naomi compiled the finalized unredacted forensic audit. This file contained absolute irrefutable proof of the shell companies, the forged procurement logs, and the illicit kickbacks Victor and Nolan Price had been funneling out of the company for years. It was no longer a theory. It was a heavily documented financial crime ready for federal prosecution. Second, Adrian prepped the digital override keys to officially unlock Evelyn's final encrypted video testament. Since Victor had brought in hostile witnesses to formally challenge the trust structure, the legal requirement for an active dispute had been met. The seal could be broken. Third, and most devastatingly, I drafted a severe, legally binding notification to the compliance department of the investment bank underwriting Victor's leveraged loan. The notice informed them that the collateral sitting in their escrow account was now officially frozen, subject to an immediate clawback order due to a catastrophic breach of testament trust. The moment that notice hit their servers, my father's massive loan would instantly vaporize, leaving him dangerously overexposed and facing immediate financial ruin. When the preparations were complete, I walked out of the war room and stepped into my private office. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass window and stared out at the Hong Kong skyline. The sky was just beginning to turn a bruised, pale purple as dawn approached. The city below was a sprawling, indifferent machine of power and commerce, completely unaware of the empire about to violently change hands above it. I pressed my hand against the cold glass. For 8 years, I had carried the weight of a failure that was never mine. I had allowed the world to view me as a volatile liability because I believed I had broken the heart of the only woman who mattered. But tomorrow morning, I was not just going to reclaim my truth or secure a logistical supply chain. I was going to systematically pull the pillars out from under my father's throne. I was going to tear off the polished, respectable mask he had worn his entire life and force the entire world to look at the greedy, hollow man hiding underneath. The countdown was finished. The stage was perfectly set. It was time to let him fall. The temperature in the executive suite felt artificially low, a biting chill that seeped straight into the marrow of my bones when the encrypted video link to the South Carolina boardroom flickered to life at exactly 9:00 in the morning. The silence was absolute and suffocating. Victor sat directly at the head of the domestic table, exuding the relaxed, magnanimous posture of a conquering general waiting to receive a formal surrender. The directors arrayed around him looked at my projection on the massive digital wall with a mixture of quiet pity and severe impatience. In their eyes, my 24-hour recess had officially expired, and I was merely a desperate woman entirely out of time, clinging by my fingernails to the edge of a sheer cliff. Nolan Price slid a thick, leather-bound document across the polished mahogany table toward my father. Victor picked up a heavy gold fountain pen. He did not look at my face on the screen. He looked directly into the camera lens, addressing the global board of directors. He stated, his voice dripping with practiced paternal sorrow, that it brought him profound personal agony to take this necessary legal step. He then formally submitted a sworn notarized affidavit to the corporate record. The declaration explicitly claimed that during the years Evelyn constructed the international holding structures, she was suffering from severe undocumented cognitive decline. The document further accused me of exploiting her diminished mental capacity to maliciously conceal vital corporate assets from the legal rightful heir. Victor signed his name with a smooth theatrical flourish. I watched the dark ink dry on the high-resolution feed. Beside me, Adrian remained perfectly still, though I could sense the microscopic electric shift in his posture. Naomi kept her eyes locked securely on her terminal. In that exact fraction of a second, the irreversible, lethal mechanism my grandmother had meticulously hidden within the trust was fully engaged. By submitting a fraudulent declaration under oath to claim the Asian network, Victor had unknowingly severed his own lifeline. But we could not celebrate. The room remained incredibly dangerous because the trap was a complex legal construct, and legal constructs require time to officially execute. The immediate real-world fallout of his signature, however, was terrifyingly swift. Naomi's secure console flashed with a rapid succession of urgent silent red alerts. The aggressive legal filing in the United States had instantly triggered automated risk management protocols across our international financial partners. 3 major allied banks in the Asian region, utterly terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a massive hostile corporate civil war, temporarily froze our operational credit lines. The lifeblood of the logistics network was suddenly and violently choked off. I saw the alerts detailing delayed fuel payments for the cryogenic medical vessels and frozen port docking fees in Manila and Taipei. The actual physical supply chain was buckling under the crushing weight of my father's fabricated dispute. On the video feed, several previously neutral board members began to visibly panic, whispering frantically to one another. They were terrified of the impending operational chaos, demanding an immediate resolution before the global markets opened and the company stock plummeted into oblivion. Sensing the rising panic and recognizing his absolute tactical advantage, Victor pushed the blade infinitely deeper. He instructed his technical team to project a series of intercepted personal emails onto the main presentation screen. They were messages I had allegedly sent to the domestic office over the past 8 years. But as I read the text glowing on the wall, my blood ran completely cold. They had been violently spliced together, stripped entirely of their original context. A firm professional refusal to attend a meaningless corporate gala was heavily edited to look like a vicious, arrogant dismissal of my grandmother's declining health. A sharp, analytical critique of a flawed supply route was manipulated to sound like I viewed the entire family legacy with absolute venomous contempt. He painted a flawless masterpiece of character assassination, framing me as an incredibly selfish, ruthlessly ambitious operator who had abandoned her own bloodline purely for personal glory. The board members stared at the fabricated evidence, their faces hardening with unmistakable judgment. I felt the overwhelming, crushing weight of public perception threatening to suffocate me. The room began to spin slightly, the chilled air growing thick and entirely unbreathable. I leaned into the microphone and formally requested a brief 15-minute recess to review the newly submitted evidentiary documents. Victor granted the request with a slow, victorious nod, clearly believing I was finally stepping out to instruct my legal team to draft the unconditional surrender papers. I pushed my heavy chair back and walked briskly out of the freezing war room, pushing open the heavy glass doors leading out to the private executive terrace. The oppressive, humid heat of the Hong Kong morning slammed into me instantly, a stark, violent contrast to the sterile chill inside. I gripped the thick steel railing with both hands, looking down at the sprawling, restless harbor. The deep water was choked with activity, massive container ships slowly navigating the channels, completely oblivious to the boardroom war raging above them. For the very first time since I found the one-way ticket in Charleston, a profound, physically exhausting doubt washed over my entire body. I actually considered taking his insulting, pathetic compromise. I stared at the dark water and thought about the absolute ease of giving up. If I signed his papers, I would get the historic townhouse in Boston. I would get millions of dollars in a silent severance package. I would never have to sit in a room with Victor, Celeste, or Nolan Price ever again. But far more importantly, the international banks would instantly unfreeze the credit lines. The cargo ships would refuel. The emergency medical supplies would reach their critical destinations across the Pacific. I could stop the bleeding immediately. I could end this incredibly ugly, dirty war right here on this balcony and walk away into a quiet, heavily funded life. My chest itched with the sheer exhaustion of fighting a man who possessed absolutely no moral boundaries. I asked myself if this was all just a desperate, hollow attempt to avenge my own wounded pride. Was I genuinely willing to risk the entire global network just to prove to a room full of sycophants that I was right? I closed my eyes, letting the chaotic industrial roar of the city wash over me. I forced myself to picture the massive reinforced warehouses sitting squarely in the typhoon zones. I pictured the thousands of dock workers drivers, and regional logistics coordinators who relied entirely on this infrastructure to feed their families and protect their communities. If I surrendered the keys to Victor today merely to save the immediate shipments, the relief would be terrifyingly temporary. He would never preserve the network. He would immediately dismantle it piece by piece. He would sell the cryogenic transport ships to the absolute highest bidder. He would aggressively liquidate the emergency warehouses to fund his flashy luxury real estate developments. Thousands of vital human lives and critical supply routes would be instantly reduced to depreciating assets on a financial spreadsheet, permanently wiped out by a single stroke of his gold pen. The agonizing pain of his betrayal, the intercepted letters from my grandmother, the forged digital signatures that had ruined my early career, none of it mattered anymore. This was no longer a broken daughter trying to settle a bitter emotional score with a cruel father. This was not about personal vengeance or family drama. It was about fundamental, absolute justice. It was about recognizing the immense heavy difference between building a legacy of actual life-saving value and acting as a corporate scavenger who only knew how to price things for a quick slaughter. Evelyn Ward had not given me a weapon to destroy my father. She had given me a massive, impenetrable shield to protect the empire from him. I opened my eyes. The suffocating doubt was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, immovable bedrock of absolute certainty. I let go of the heated steel railing and turned my back on the harbor. I walked back through the heavy glass doors, the humid air instantly giving way to the biting clinical chill of the executive suite. Adrian and Naomi looked up at me from their glowing monitors, silently waiting for my final command. I did not look like a woman calculating her own survival anymore. I walked back to my chair at the exact center of the table. I was the final gatekeeper, and the gates were officially permanently closed. The 15 minutes expired. I walked back into the freezing command center and took my seat on the digital wall. My father leaned forward, pen in hand, a look of faux sympathy plastered across his face. He asked if I was ready to formally concede. I did not answer him. Instead, I nodded to Adrian. The senior counsel stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked into full view of the camera. He looked past my father and addressed the global board of directors, the legal teams, and the hovering bank representatives. Pursuant to Section 4, Paragraph 9 of the Harbor Lantern Trust Master Charter, Adrian's voice rang out, sharp and unyielding. Victor Ward has formally challenged the legal architecture of this entity and submitted a sworn affidavit alleging fiduciary malfeasance. This aggressive legal action officially qualifies as a Tier 1 testimonial dispute. As such, I am legally obligated by the late Evelyn Ward to immediately unseal and broadcast her final digital directive to this exact assembly before Victor could shout an objection or Nolan Price could scramble to find a legal loophole. Naomi hit the execution key. My father's shocked face vanished from the main projection, instantly replaced by a high pre-recorded video. There sat my grandmother, Evelyn Ward. She looked frail, clearly in the final months of her life, but her eyes were entirely lucid and burned with a terrifying cold intelligence. The boardroom in South Carolina fell so silent I could hear the faint static of the audio feed. "If you are watching this," Evelyn's voice echoed through both rooms, strong and devoid of any sentimental warmth, "it means my son, Victor, could not simply take his winnings and go home. It means his greed has finally outpaced his very limited caution." She looked directly into the camera, effectively staring my father down from beyond the grave. "Victor, the $100 million you received at the reading was never a reward. It was a carefully designed piece of bait. I knew you would view it as an insult. I knew you would use it not to build, but to tear down everything I spent my life constructing just to feed your own ego. I needed you to publicly prove to the board that you are entirely unfit to manage the physical infrastructure of this empire." Evelyn shifted her gaze, addressing the broader assembly. "I did not leave the core international assets to Scarlett out of some misguided familial affection. I left them to her because she is the only person bearing the Ward name who understands the fundamental difference between actual value and a fast sale price. She knows what must be protected in the dark, while the rest of you only care about what can be shown off in the light." The video cut to black. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the devastating weight of a matriarch's final judgment. But we were not finished. We were not even close. Naomi Pike immediately took control of the presentation screen. She did not give Victor a single second to formulate a defense. The screen illuminated with the heavily encrypted certified bank intercepts we had secured the night before. Just hours ago, Naomi stated, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of an executioner. Victor Ward leveraged 75% of his liquid inheritance. He placed those funds into a predatory escrow account to secure a highly leveraged loan, intending to launch a hostile takeover of the domestic floating shares. By utilizing the inheritance as a weapon of corporate aggression against the estate, he has triggered the punitive clawback clause written explicitly into the master will highlight a massive digital transfer receipt. As of 2 minutes ago, the entirety of the $100 million has been legally seized. The funds have been permanently and irrevocably transferred into the Ward Meridian Employee and Retiree Sustainability Fund. Victor Ward is currently holding a massive corporate loan with absolutely zero collateral. I watched the color completely drain from my father's face. The smug, triumphant mask shattered into a million pieces. He looked at Nolan Price, his eyes wide with rising panic. But the lawyer was violently trembling, his hands buried in his face. And then Naomi delivered the final fatal blow. She dumped the unredacted forensic audit onto the screens. Hundreds of pages of evidence flooded the display. The board members gasped as they saw the complex web of shell companies, the forged procurement loans from 8 years ago, and the illicit kickbacks flowing directly into offshore accounts controlled by Victor, Celeste, and Nolan Price. The quiet, insidious bleeding of the company was finally dragged into the blinding fluorescent light. The sheer volume of the undeniable proof broke Victor completely. The polished, aristocratic patriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. He leaped out of his heavy leather chair, his face violently red, and began screaming at the camera. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You think you won?" he roared, entirely abandoning any pretense of professionalism. "You think you can run this company? This entire Asian network is nothing but a massive pile of slowly yielding garbage. Those relief ships and medical coolers are a massive financial anchor. I was going to liquidate every single piece of that pathetic, bleeding heart infrastructure and finally make us real money. I should have sold it all for scrap 10 years ago." His words echoed off the mahogany walls. He had just confessed his absolute contempt for the company's life-saving mission in front of every single executive and voting member. The few directors who had been wavering, the ones who had considered his earlier compromise, stared at him in profound, unadulterated horror. He had just proven Evelyn's video completely right. The board did not even need to deliberate in private. The senior domestic director immediately called for an emergency binding vote. It was swift, brutal, and entirely unanimous. Victor Ward was immediately stripped of his board seat and terminated from all executive positions, effective instantly. Nolan Price was formally suspended, escorted out of the building by corporate security, and his files were seized for the impending criminal and civil investigations. Finally, the board formally recognized my position. They legally ratified me, Scarlett Ward, as the undisputed controller of the Harbor Lantern Trust, granting me absolute strategic veto power over the entire global system. When the video feed from South Carolina finally cut out, plunging the main digital wall back into darkness, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright for days slowly began to recede. Adrian and Naomi stood beside me, their expressions reflecting a deep, exhausted satisfaction. They offered quiet congratulations, acknowledging the monumental shift in power, but I did not feel the urge to pop champagne or celebrate loudly. I walked away from the heavy conference table and returned to my private office. I stood before the massive glass windows, looking down at the sprawling, vibrant port of Hong Kong. The sun was fully up now, casting a brilliant golden light across the dark water. The massive cargo ships were moving steadily, carrying the vital supplies that would continue to flow uninterrupted because of what we had done today. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the thin, slightly crumpled one-way boarding pass. I traced the small circle of violet ink with my thumb. For weeks, I had believed this piece of paper was the ultimate symbol of my family's rejection. But standing here watching the empire operate under my protection, I finally understood the truth. The humiliation I had suffered in that stuffy library in Charleston was never a punishment. It was a crucible. It was the only possible path my grandmother could force me down to make me reclaim my truth, my professional honor, and the true heavy power required to protect her legacy. Victor had lost his money, his power, and the carefully constructed fictional story he had told about himself for decades. He lost absolutely everything for one simple fatal reason. He had acted exactly according to his own greedy nature the moment he heard those 5 words. Your father took the bait. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So, please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button so that this story can reach and be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.